So the Elvis movie certainly was a picture.
He's white.
What do you think, Texarkana?
So it's probably inevitable that a biopic of one of the most famous musicians who ever lived, who shaped music as it is today, whether you agree he deserves that credit or not, would come here with some misgivings. Especially when you see the trailer and it looks like something that's just been pulled out of the Dude Cox playbook.
You never once paid for drugs.
Not once.
Musical biopics, while they've never really gone away, have certainly made a massive surge in popularity recently, and this is contentious. Might be the nicest way to put it. And critiques of them are certainly floating around, one particular from Patrick H. Willems, which got me on this train of thought. 3 years ago. Yeah, it takes me a while to make videos. But one thing that really got my mind aflutter regarding this is a quote from Baz Luhrmann, the director of Elvis, describing it.
It's really, for me, about America in the 50s and 60s and 70s. If you want to talk about America in the 50s and 60s and 70s, at the center of culture, for the good, the bad, and the ugly, was Elvis. If it feels a bit like a superhero film, it is. Because actually, Elvis is like the original superhero.
This struck me because even if you have a passing knowledge of Elvis, this puts this superhero idea under a little bit of scrutiny. But here's the thing, it's not a terrible way to describe this. And the one thing that's interesting about this movie is that it puts the entire musical biopic framework under a certain new lens, nearly. So what is this framework? Are musical biopics being this formulated good? What is a good way to tell a biopic? Why do some succeed where others fail? I don't know, but I have some thoughts. Because if there's one thing that really saves this movie called Elvis, starring Elvis, it's not really about Elvis. It's about Colonel Tom Parker. It's about how he expropriated and exploited this resource to its bitter end for his own personal profit and success. Damn if he drains it towards complete ruination. Yeah, this movie's about capitalism, sorry. But I'll get into that. Let's just go back a bit though. Biopic is a term that is thrown around a lot, but it's never really properly defined outside of being this kind of thing where it's about a famous person and I don't like the movie. Let's be insanely basic, bitches, and start off with the Wikipedia definition to get us going. A biopic is a film that dramatizes the life of a non-fictional or historically based person or people. Such films show the life of said historical person and their real name is used. They try to comprehensively tell this person's or people's lives in a way that is dramatically satisfying, or they take a very big moment in their life and focus on that. That seems clear cut, right? For one, they define historically important years of people's lives, which means that it's not just cradle to grave, it's usually a summarized chunk of their most famous points of their careers. And this is most of biopics of what they follow. Most don't really follow from the birth of a person to the death of a person. But then you have films like 2012's Hitchcock, which only really focuses on the production of Psycho, which was roughly about a year of his life tops. That's still considered a biopic, but it's a very, very small portion of this man's long life. The Favourite is about a real-life monarch, Queen Anne, and two of her courtship, who tried to gain her favour in this series of events. Would that consider to be a biopic? Not really, because the focus of it is based on what were spurious rumours at the time, but were never verified. There's no historical accuracy really focused in on the film, and the film doesn't really find that important. So, no, this wouldn't be considered a biopic. So biopics are historically accurate then. Put a pin on that. We'll get back to that. There are movies out there that focus on real-life events with real-life people, but because the focus is on the event and not the actual person in question, they can't really be classified as a biopic. Great example of this is Argo, which has people as notable as Jack Kirby in it, but it's not about any person involved. It's about this fake movie they set up as a ruse to try to get American people extradited out of Iran. This tends to be when people focus on biopics, they mainly talk about musical biopics because they are the easiest to define and they are some of the most formulated films ever made. As I'm basically just leapfrogging off this video while talking about these things, I'll just let Patrick H. Willems himself define the formula of a musical biopic.
Usually the movie begins late in the subject's career, right before they go on stage for an iconic performance. Then it jumps back to their childhood where some sort of tragedy occurs. Then once they're older, there's the moment of discovery where they play their instrument in front of strangers and they're immediately blown away by their talent. And then suddenly, we jump to performances in front of adoring fans. The scene where they record their first song and have to win over a cynical producer. The moment that song becomes a radio hit. And then we're on tour. This is where the film goes really heavy on the montages. Now we get to the point where they start innovating and pushing their music forward, which tends to coincide with them taking drugs. There are more montages. Their marriages become strange due to the cheating and the drug use. And then we get to the dark period. They alienate the people closest to them, are rarely sober, and usually eventually go to rehab. Then they clean up, get back to the music, play a big amazing concert, and it ends on a freeze frame.
Pretty standard stuff. So with this in mind, let's define a biopic. What factors go into that makes a movie a biopic? And not just a musical one, like generally what a biopic is. I've broken it down to 3 factors that they all seem to have in common. Roughly. Number 1, most importantly, was obviously it's about a real life person or people. So Larry counts here, even though the film is about his experience in the Ottoman Empire during World War One. Movie is about him, technically classifies as a biopic. Speaking of, and number 2, while the movie can focus on any part of this person's life in any kind of segment, the plot has to focus on them, not the event surrounding them. So we take something like Passion of Joan of Arc, which was about her execution and the horrible way she was treated. That's more of a focus of it than it being really a character study of this woman. So we look at movies like Frost and Nixon and Elvis and Nixon, a lot of these are about Nixon for some reason. They're not really biopics because they're not about the men in question. They're about an event that happened in their lives, if you can kind of get that distinction. Number 3, the general framework of this plot has to have some basis in reality of something that actually happened to the person in question. So a film like The Favourite is about real people, but the events they're in, the plot, is largely fictionalized as far as people understand. Consequently, a film like Spencer, where most people know that the events that happen in that film are largely fictionalized, they're actually framed in a real life event where Diana went to Christmas with the royal family as she was contemplating getting a divorce. So that can technically count as a biopic. So the first 2 things, they generally overlap and are mostly understood by audiences. It's one of those things where you actually just read the description of a film where it clicks in you, oh, this is a biopic. The real tension is this general framework thing I put out there and how far that can be stretched. Because I think most people can agree a lot of these biopics just throw shit in there, regardless of whether it happened or not, for dramatic license.
A biographical movie portrays the life of a non-fictional or historical figure. However, this version of their life story is often dramatized to create a more appealing film. The essence of that person's life, however, must be kept throughout. Docudrama films and historical drama films differ from biopics by focusing on whole events or periods. Biopics focus solely on a single person's life and their most important moments.
So let's unpin that imaginary page, I guess, and talk about fictionalized events that happen within biopics in these real life people's stories, starting with one of the most popular and successful biopics of our recent time. So Bohemian Rhapsody has an infamously troubled production history. Talks about it started around 2008 with Peter Morgan attached to write the screenplay. He's better known now for creating The Crown. Even at this project's inception, however, Morgan found it difficult to write something that would suit the 2 standing members of Cream, Roger Taylor and Brian Mays, which caused some anxieties in terms of his screenwriting process.
I'm not sure how much they'll like what I write. I think they'll recognize the truth in it, but it's a series of painful memories for them. I'm essentially writing about the most painful time in the band's history.
What Morgan is referring to here is the time the band took off right before they did Live Aid, as they were faced severe criticism for the fact that they performed in apartheid South Africa. This is conspicuously missing from the movie, but what they replaced it with, oh boy, oh man, will we get back to that. And honestly, this script sounds better here. They're going to be way more focused on the band than just Freddie himself, and was going to lead into the Live Aid concert where the movie would have commenced. They were even planning on dodging Mercury's AIDS diagnosis, which was a really controversial decision at the time. But in terms of the context of like where they were bringing with this movie, it made sense. Like if the movie was going to focus on the band, you didn't really need to focus on every aspect of this one person's life in terms of their significance to it. Freddie Mercury was originally cast by Sacha Baron Cohen until rather infamously he left the project in 2013, citing disagreements between the two band members. In particular, Brian May, and if you look up anything about this, the two of them have taken pot shots at each other for years now. Because we don't have a clear picture here, and in the interest of fairness, May claimed he didn't take the role seriously enough, that people would not be able to see him outside of him being a famous comedian. He said a lot of stuff over the years, to be honest. Cohen later went on to Howard Stern to claim that they're planning on killing Freddie Mercury off halfway through the film and continuing from there. Honestly, one of the most damning things about this whole thing was not from either of them, but from the Deadline article that broke this story.
The reason is that the band wanted to make more of a PG movie about Queen, while Cohen was counting on a gritty R-rated tell-all centered around the gifted gay singer.
And if you think that wasn't the approach they took with this movie, we watched different movies. I won't go through the entire production process here because there's a lot, but eventually they landed on celebrated filmmaker and Oh God, Oh Man, Do Not Look Him Up Brian Singer, and Rami Malek was cast in the lead. Morgan's script was used with a rewrite by Darkest Hour and Theory of Everything scribe Anthony McCartan. The focus was put on Freddie, but the climax was decided to be at the Live Aid concert. Now, I need to make this clear. The idea that Roger Taylor and Brian May had this massive overreaching power over this production, it's a little silly. They were consultants and they were credited as music producers because obviously they use all their music. And it is absolutely fair that they would have wanted the depiction of their deceased bandmate and friend to be as reverent as possible. That just makes sense. Imagine if it was your friend. I can get why they would be so protective of his image and how he was depicted. But that's a problem, isn't it? No matter how you look at this, they are going to be motivated by the fact that they loved Freddie, and that's going to cloud their judgment. As well as everybody else in the project, really. You can see it in Morgan's reticence because, he knows these guys and he's going to be depicting them live on screen. Plus, it's probably not all that coincidental that when you see the movie, May and Taylor have squeaky clean images, especially when compared to Freddie. He's the terror aide, the others are sensible family men who just want to talk about the music. As Mercury gets in with it at the press, like a child. With this groundwork laid, let's talk about two scenes which, and I cannot stress this enough, did not happen. The first takes place just before the third act, where Freddie decides to go on a solo contract and is accused of breaking up Queen. And if you couldn't tell, this is what they replaced the South Africa stuff with. That Freddie decided to go on his own, he was being talked to by somebody else, and this is why the band were not really performing together right before the Live Aid gig. Instead of this massively ethical, complex dilemma, it's a petty squabble between them that makes Freddie look like a clueless, high-maintenance fool. Not only did this never happen, Freddie wasn't even the first one of the band to do solo work. They had lives and interests in their careers outside of Queen. Most bands do. They'd go insane otherwise. Better still, Freddie can't be the one responsible for coming up with this idea independently. Paul Prenter has to be the one to talk him into this because Freddie can be a little raucous and mischievous, but he can't be callous or cruel. No, let's make him look like an easily led child instead, while the other band members look like prodigal saints in comparison. You can't be pissing off the Queen Sultans. Did you know that one of them was nearly a dentist and the other an astrophysicist? The other scene is after they've made up and they're rehearsing for Live Aid. This is the moment where Mercury breaks to his bandmates that he has AIDS.
I've got it. Got what? AIDS.
This is actually pushed back long before Freddie told them about this. And this decision was contentious for a lot of people. I'm not one of them. I actually don't mind this change. Maybe if this was about the band themselves and not specifically about Freddie, I would have more of an issue with this. But because they're doing the whole Copperfield thing of the whole life and summing it up together, it would be weird for them not to bring up what killed him in this biopic of his life. And especially the case not showing how his bandmates reacted to it. They play up every other aspect of Freddie's life. Not mentioning how it ended would have been a disservice to him, at least I think. Granted, it probably would have helped if the other band members in the movie were given any sort of character like Freddie, but I digress. So why am I talking about these scenes in particular? Well, they exemplify a thing that people complain about a lot in this film, and that is the historical inaccuracies. I mean, most of the pitch meeting episode on this movie is mostly about that joke. And I think that kind of misses the problem here. Because from the limited viewpoint of the stuff I've read and just watching the movie, this seems like a clash of egos and trying to figure out and work what's the best way to tell the story of Freddie Mercury and Queen. And that's what the issue is. His loved ones wanted what's best for Freddie, which makes sense. They knew him, they loved him, but it's not what's best for the movie. And the film itself is air. It's a random assortment of segments that maybe happened in Freddie's life with no motive, theme, or intent. It's a lot more concerned with valorizing this band and its beloved dead artist rather than telling a story. And in my opinion, that is more insulting to Freddie's memory than if you just made him look like a complete arsehole. So here's some thoughts on the back of this on what can make a perfect biopic. Pick a team, a motif, anything to run the story. Bohemian Rhapsody is about Freddie Mercury, but it's a story of him. Human lives are not stories. They do not have the framing or the catharsis to be like that. That's why I think they should have made a movie about the band and their camaraderie. That would have given us some grounding to tell a coherent and satisfying tale. Another thing is to remove the ego. These movies are about people. People are flawed, messy, and supremely more interesting than the glitzy pop icon status they are given to, especially when it comes to these musicians. Don't make Freddie a drunken tearaway easily led by people whispering into his ear. Show us the man behind the icon. Finally, and more paradoxically, as my last point is all about being honest about a person, don't let historical events and the truth get in the way of telling a good story. Because as you're telling a narrative and navigating that, there is a difference between reality and honesty. Now, with that out of the way, let's go into why my last point may have a few hurdles. So, this seems like an obvious point. This was actually brought up rather recently over the Marilyn Monroe biopic that's coming out soon, which takes some liberties with her life. YouTuber Emileigh made a comment about this, and I responded to it in a rather unkind way, I'll admit. Sorry, my Twitter presence is really shitty. But this did cause me to actually go out and watch her video on this subject, which I would recommend. Taking a rather different approach, but she goes into a lot of interesting thoughts on biopics and exploitation of people, and actually how the true crime kind of boom feeds into this, which a lot of it I do agree with. But I'd also be lying if biopics didn't do this as well, or even just depictions of real life events. One example of this is Paul Printer. I swear to God, I will stop talking about Bohemian Rhapsody soon. And before I go any further, it needs be said, Paul Printer is a contentious figure, to put it mildly. He straight up sold Freddie Mercury under the bus for a check to the press, revealing all kinds of gossip about his sexuality and the fact that 2 of his former partners were diagnosed with AIDS at the height of the AIDS crisis. This is also reported into The Sun, not actually on TV as the movie depicts it, but again, dramatic license. As I said, for the strength of the story. That was fucked up. Printer was rightfully never forgiven by Mercury over this. Also, Printer was desperate for money after being fired because he was also diagnosed with AIDS. Does this justify what he did? No, not at all. But it does paint a clear picture on why he did this. Printer is also dead. He passed away a few months after Freddie, and his brothers actually came to the press explaining that a lot of misconceptions about the movie, painting him as some Iago-esque figure leading Mercury in his manipulative little ways. Also, the stuff about his parents were apparently a misconception, as it plays on a lot of really dumb stereotypes between queer people and Irish Catholics. They also claimed him and Freddie were not lovers, but that's neither here nor there. Now, his family obviously have reasons to depict him in better light. Brian May does not, and as he said in an Instagram post, he wasn't all bad. Dude, you worked on the fucking film. What the hell? But okay, that isn't the only example. Yes, other films besides Bohemian Rhapsody did bad things. One of the most famous examples is in Titanic. One of the most famous examples is in Titanic. Itself not a biopic, rather famously the 2 leads are fictional, but had real people, including First Officer William Murdoch. This movie depicts Murdoch murdering 2 passengers in the desperate scramble to get to lifeboats, and then shooting himself falling into the ocean. While it's difficult to get a clear picture of what happened on the Titanic with, eyewitnesses panicking and running for their lives, one passenger claimed that they thought they saw Murdoch firing into the air, and Cameron just used that and went with it. It also shows in the movie that he took bribes, which has fuck all evidence going behind it. Murdoch's ancestors and the town took massive offense to this, to the point where they were actually given compensation over the depiction, and the rather famously prickly Cameron issued a statement where he regretted how he dramatized this.
I think I have come to the realization that it was probably a mistake to portray a specific person. First Officer Murdoch has a family, some surviving family, and they took exception to that, and I think rightly so.
The website I got this quote from, by the way, it was set up because of the inaccuracies around Murdoch that were set by this movie. And even in the statement which they published on their website, they pretty much said that this doesn't sound like an apology to them. This kind of shows how seriously people take this stuff. But hey, if you watch Emileigh's video, you can at least say that Cameron acknowledged he made a mistake when compared to Ridley Scott, who just went, it's in the public domain when talking about House of Gucci. Another incredibly juicy one is in the Clint Eastwood film Richard Jewell, which depicts the man who was wrongfully accused of the Centennial Olympic Park bombings in 1995. Now, it's fucked up what happened to this man, and I completely get sympathizing with him throughout telling of the story. What I bring into question is depicting a dead woman as a severely unethical reporter who used to sleep around to get stories. If you notice a pattern, most of the people they seem to depict as awful or more awful are dead and can't really defend themselves. Cathy Scruggs was a reporter for the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, and she was the one who broke the story that Jewell was accused of being the bomber. Now, we know he is not, and she narrowly avoided facing jail time on appeal because she refused to give up her source for that information. This whole thing and the ensuing lawsuit from Jewell to the paper kind of just destroyed her life, and she eventually died of a prescription drug overdose in 2001. Now, it's difficult to sympathize with this woman who went off on this bogus intel and destroyed this man's life as the entire country thought he was a mass bomber. But I'm not sure how much this justifies playing into a really sexist stereotype that female reporters just go around and sleep for stories and intel, especially as this is based on one very dubious source, and most people say that she wasn't like this. She never slept with people for a story. Contentious though she is, and she absolutely fucked up here, she does not deserve to be tarred posthumously in a massive movie like this. And it's a shame because one of her colleagues said that outside of this, the movie pretty much gets her bang on.
If you wanted to draw a Hollywood stereotype of a hard-charging female cops reporter, Cathy would fit that bill pretty well. She was a great reporter. She used her strength of personality and her looks to work sources. When you're a cop reporter, you have to be able to throw it and show it. Get in there with them, and not take any shit off them. She was great at that. I think that's one of the reasons why she was so successful working with cop sources, whether it was beat cops or detectives in a homicide squad. She was pretty fearless. But it's jumping over that last wall to make it look like she traded sexual favors for information? That's just bullshit.
Unlike the other claims here, this one was pretty much combated against publicly because it was more of an implication than it was a definitive statement that she slept for stories. Screenwriter Briley Ray claims that this is a distraction tactic by the paper to avoid their own culpability in this case.
This movie is about a hero whose life was completely destroyed by myths created by the FBI and the media, specifically the AJC. The AJC hung Richard Jewell in public. They editorialized wildly and printed assumptions as facts. They compared him to noted mass murderer Wayne Williams, and this was after he had saved hundreds of lives. Now a movie comes along 23 years later, a perfect chance for the AJC to atone for what they did to Richard and to admit to their misdeeds. And what do they decide to do? They launch a distraction campaign. They deflect and distort, opting to challenge one assertion in the movie rather than accepting their own role in destroying the life of a good man. The movie isn't about Cathy Scruggs. It's about the heroism and hounding of Richard Jewell and what rushed reporting can do to an innocent man. And by the way, I will stand by every word and assertion in the script.
And that's actually a really good point. More focus should really be put on the miscarriage of justice and this really unethical reporting that got this man's name out into the public when he was just a suspect. Does this still justify them smearing the name of a complicated woman by implicating she fucks around for scoops? I don't think so. Especially as this whole thing blowing up is more complicated than just the movie saying woman bad, as I think there's a bit more to this that we should investigate into.
She was incredibly successful as a cop reporter. She had a very close relationship with the cops and the FBI helping to tell their story. And yes, by all accounts, she had relationships with different people in that field. But what I resented was this character being boiled down to one inferred scene, and I don't hear anyone complaining about John Hamm's character as being inferred that he also had a relationship with a reporter. It feels unfair that Kathy has been minimised in this way. I think that we are still struggling with allowing for female characters who aren't entirely quote unquote likeable. If there's anything slightly questionable about a female character, we often use that in relation to condemn that character or to condemn the project for allowing for a woman to be impure in a way. It's a misunderstanding of feminism to assume that all women have to be sexless. I resent the character being minimised to that point.
Hello, my moos. I'm interjecting very, very quickly. I'm hoping I'll make this quick. Because as I was, I think even when I was recording this, there's a joy in how long it takes me to make any of these fucking things, or a curse. The movie Don't Worry, Darling, which is directed by Olivia Wilde, has caused a kind of shitstorm. If you don't know anything about this, you are blessed. I wish I had your scope of knowledge, but make a long story short, there's a lot of drama around this movie, particularly with Wilde and the lead Florence Pugh. There's stuff about her relationship with Harry Styles, but one of the most prevalent things is the handling of Shia LaBeouf, who was on this film until he was either fired or he quit over assault allegations that eventually came to light. And there's a video going around showing that Wilde didn't exactly handle this amazingly and was really condescending to Florence Pugh. There's some other stuff, but this in particular stuck out. And to be crystal clear, I do not think Wilde has handled this amazingly well. And this has fuck all to do with this video, but I know of the 5 people who might get to this point, and they see me using this woman talking about sexism and using that to defend a movie made by Clint Eastwood, they're going to point this out. So to be clear, don't really condone how Wilde has handled this. And in terms of this quote, yes, it is weird for me to quote her regarding this subject. I do think she makes a decent point, which I will go on to clarify. But if you're going to bring this up, yeah, I get it. I get if you have issues with Wilde and the way that whole thing happened, but yeah, I'm keeping this quote. Cool. On with the show.
It should be noted that John Hamm's character is like an amalgamation of different federal officers who worked on this case, which is another interesting layer of biopics and depictions. But I trust that Wilde did more research into this person's life than I did. It's an interesting rebuttal to this controversy that brings into question, what does it mean to depict real life people as characters? Like, for all of them, by the very nature of the medium, they're going to be simplified down to their more basic assets. And is that right? Is that correct? Do our own biases affect this? Like, for example, a woman who did flaunt her sexuality around while on the job would possibly get involved in a relationship with a police officer or anybody else she would have worked with. Are we reading into this fact to say that the movie's implying she slept to get the source? Or is this just the people who worked on a movie trying to cover their asses here? With people like Renter and Scruggs, they did a lot of messed up things that hurt people. But to depict him as just being this kind of amoral or just grossly deceptive and hateful, it's just kind of boring, and it reduces what could be more interesting characters to very basic roles in the plot. It tells exactly who to root for, and we should trust our audiences more in how we frame these things. And I think, as always, framing is important. Adapting people's stories should train us to understand that what is being told here may be manipulated or simplified for our entertainment. That is the better direction to take this. When somebody goes into based on a true story, they focus on the based on more so than the true. But I guess if audiences focused on that, they wouldn't dole out as much Oscars for these things. And conditioning audiences to automatically just assume what they are watching is not entirely based on reality or fact. It's pretty difficult to get to that place if that's the direction we push telling these stories into. But having said that, and yet again, The Favourite is based on real life people, and nobody assumes that Queen Anne was fucking her female courtship. At least I think so. And the film doesn't stray that far away from reality. It is very weird, but it's actually way more normal than most of the director's work if you watch over him. Yorgos Lanthimos is great, by the way, if you don't I've never watched any of his stuff. So maybe it's actually not that difficult to communicate this to the audiences in question. And so maybe one way of doing that is to play with the form, to play with the conventions of the musical biopic. Speaking of, I want to talk about two films that broke off from the biopic formula but don't quite leave the confines as we were talking about. First off, one of these films I did like.
Excuse me. You can't put that there.
Why not?
You'll get knocked off.
So we mentioned The Formula, something that Patrick H. Willems dissected about 3 years ago. While I agree that formulas are overused in general, I think it's just an easy way to dissect what the issues with movies like this are. I don't think they're inherently bad on their own.
I like formula.
The best thing, if you're going to structure a script by a try-to-test formula like the one that Willems pointed out, you can do something that kind of twists it and gives us something more interesting and, moves away from these kind of confines that audiences grow sick of. And that's something that Rocketman did. Directed by Dexter Fletcher, who actually did ghost direct parts of Bohemian Rhapsody, Rocketman, in a kind of similar vein, looks at the life of one Elton John. It even scopes out a similar timeline, even a bigger one, in fact. There are two things that make Rocketman stand out. One, and probably most noticeably, is that it's a jukebox musical of Elton's music. Usually the music is either played by the band or is played over the scenes non-diegetically. And I mean, that's cool and all, but if I want to listen to their music, I can just listen to one of their albums. And I mean, you could do the same by just listening to the album of the Rocketman covers, but you definitely do not get the same experience while you watch the movie. The emotional isolation of the tiny dancer segment, that pit of despair in the Rocketman bit, the youthful triumph of Saturday Night's Alright for Fighting that transitions from Elton's youth into his adulthood. It gives everything this fun-flowing energy, while sticking to said formula, but it does it in this novel way of telling the story of this man. The second thing that works about this film is that it utilizes the Copperfield structure to actually tell a story of Elton and his identity, with his sexuality, with his rise to catapulting rise to stardom. Elton in this film deals with imposter syndrome.
Right then. I know how this bit goes.
Not only does that help with the grounding of the film, it makes Elton feel a lot more human and relatable. Even with his own struggles, with his toxic relationship with his then manager, John Reed, and also the other stuff about, this self-destructive rock star, it doesn't shy away from depicting Elton as, well, kind of a prick sometimes.
People don't pay to see Reginald Dwight. They pay to see Elton John. Don't ever tell me how to do my fucking job!
Part of what helps is that, Elton's still alive when they're telling his story. The developmental of this is kind of similar to Bohemian Rhapsody, actually, because they couldn't decide how to tell a story. Because Elton was not telling a PG-13 version of his life.
When I decided I did want to go ahead with the film, we commissioned a script from Lee Hall, who I did work with on the stage musical of Billy Elliot. It was brilliant. It had moments that were pure fantasy and moments that were really hard-hitting. No punches pulled like tantrums and terrors. The documentary my husband David made about me not long after we met. Lots of people told me I was insane that the documentary to be released, but I loved it because it was truthful. There are moments in it and moments in that film where I'm completely disgusted and awful. But then again, at my worst, I was disgusting and awful, and there's no reason to pretend otherwise. Some studios wanted to tone down the sex and drugs so the film would get a PG-13 rating. But I just haven't led a PG-13 rated life. I didn't want a film packed with drugs and sex, but equally everybody knows I had quite a lot of both during the 70s and 80s. So there didn't seem to be much point in making a movie that implied that after every gig I'd quietly go back to my hotel room with only a glass of warm milk and the Gideon's Bible for company.
He was determined to tell the authentic self. And yes, sometimes that means depicting him as an arsehole. And that's what every biopic needs. Whether alive or dead, somebody there to say, make them a lot more authentic and flawed. And I mean, this isn't all perfect. While I do think the formula gives something to this movie that it wouldn't have otherwise, it does run out of steam near the end, and it's just kind of going through the motions while playing the popular jams, and it does hold back a little bit. Elton's first marriage is very much glossed over, though that could be for legal reasons, because even the little they show in this got him dragged into court. I don't want to go more into this because it seems like a really murky, complicated situation, but again, the movie is limited on being entirely truthful of this man's life. I'll link an article below if you're more interested in reading the story. There's not much there though. Still, it's a coldly reminiscent of a depiction, not afraid to show the edges, but still fitting into that kind of comfort blanket of a biopic, and this person that you really admire is not entirely shown to be someone who could be a contentious figure.
Sorry, I know.
Hey, you know a film that does do this really well? Okay. Stop it. Stop right there. Stop. This movie is not good, and in a lot of ways is exceptionally insulting. Bowie never wanted a movie about his life. They waited 5 years that he was in the ground before bringing this turkey out. His family have no involvement with this, and while I stated really clearly that I think that the loved ones being involved in the storytelling should be a bit more limited, to not involve them at all and to not get any kind of support from the estate, it's really messed up. Like, how are you supposed to tell an authentic story if you won't talk to the people who knew him? It also led to the rather well purported and frankly hilarious fact that they could not play any of David Bowie's songs, which makes this come out like a fucking 30 Rock joke.
We didn't get the songs. I wrote this myself 5 minutes ago.
You know you bought it if life makes you sweet food.
Even outside of that, like, on its own merits, I don't think Johnny Flynn is a really good casting for Bowie. I think he's a good actor, I just don't think he's good in this part. I really don't like how they depict Angie. I'm sure she had her contentious side, but the way they bring her out to be this nagging stereotype of a wife is extremely exhausting and very not well written. It also has some really questionable depictions about mental health, which is a huge aspect of it. However, I am not saying that everything about this movie works. I'm saying there's an element of it that could show a compelling way of depicting an icon's life that makes it feel grounded. Contrasting his relationship with his brother and his brother's influence on his music to Mark Maron trying to cheerlead for him and get him on the go in America at the point of his career where it was looking really downhill. There's a lot of stuff here that's compelling. Again, I'm not crazy about the way they depicted his brother's mental health, and again, I do not think David Bowie would have been really happy about this had he been alive to see this. But it's also really cool that they depict a part of his life that no one would have really thought of doing, and that's something that biopics should do more of. And Bowie's allowed to be unlikable in a way that makes him feel, again, human, but I don't feel disrespects him in any way in terms of the depiction. Making the movie disrespects him a lot, but again, that's a different discussion. We're talking about the framing of this, not the behind the scenes stuff about the film, which I don't think you should ignore in this case, but again, it's an example. But I mean, the entire production of this is unfair. Like, if he doesn't want a biopic made about him, don't do it. Like, you waited not even a decade before he died, before he brought this out. His family are really against this. And again, the use of the brother is brought down by the depiction of his mental health. Something that actually goes into the mental health of a star that also does the side split of two stories contrasting each other is Love and Mercy, the 2014 movie about the Beach Boys founder Brian Wilson. In fact, I probably should have used that movie as the example here instead of Stardust. You know, the movie that most people who know it seem to really love it instead of one that's universally panned, hated by its fans, despised by the family, and extremely disrespectful to the wishes of the person it's depicting. In fact, I think it did. Love and Mercy probably gets my point across better. But we should learn from the bad, and this movie chronologically fits into from Bo Rap to Elvis. We've got to get controversy, rage clicks involved in this somehow. Anyway, maybe we should finally talk about Elvis.
I didn't do it to lionize him so much as to use Elvis as a canvas on which to explore these stupid ideas in America, which is selling show and business. When the business gets out of whack with the show, then tragedy ensues.
There's a scene in this movie pretty early on. It's just after Elvis gets his big break, and the Colonel comes in with a load of merchandise with Elvis's name and face plastered everywhere, and he shows the "I love Elvis" and "I hate Elvis" pins. And like the mother points this out in disgust that she says, "I hate Elvis." The Colonel points out that people are going to hate him for free anyway, so you might as well make money off it. Elvis replies, "Snowman strikes again," a sentiment he repeats a lot when the Colonel starts manipulating him into his grasp. That's what this film is about. That's the story. The excess of capitalist exploitation and how it can destroy you, like it did the most popular musician of the 20th century. And this kind of follows Lorman's sensibility as a storyteller. I've only really seen Romeo plus Juliet and Moulin Rouge, but they're both movies about protagonists who are so lost in their own passions and desires that they ignore the external forces that are coming into them and crushing them, that it later leads to tragedy and the failure destruction of their own lives. Same thing happens with Elvis. For Romeo plus Juliet, it's the conflict between the two families that has seemed to gone on before either of the two leads are born. For Moulin Rouge, it's the desperation of entertainment venues to be profitable and to stay afloat, while other people in them ignore this for the artistry rather than looking at the commerce that makes it happen. And this fits Mr. Presley too, as his rising ambitions were taken advantage of by a con man who basically just went to the cow until the cow could not produce any more milk. And again, like I said at the start, this is about Colonel Tom Parker, not really about Elvis. Or at least it should be, I'll get back to that. If this is a superhero film, we might as well follow the most popular of the tropes. The reflective villain. Elvis is the showman, the Colonel is the snowman. They both go to audiences with their charm to give them what they want. Except in Parker's case, he's doing it to a talent he believes will secure him for life, as long as his talent is firmly within his reins. And I mean, we get the long-suffering love interest, the dying parent, the plucky supporting cast and sidekicks abound, an origin story that shows the source of his power, even Elvis contemplating how with great power there must be great responsibility.
That moment, I watched that skinny boy transform into a superhero.
Except in this case, he's a white dude gyrating on stage in pre-civil rights America. And I mean, I think this brings up the bigger problem with this, in that Elvis Presley wasn't a superhero, he was a man. And while I don't think this movie entirely embellishes him, like we see the infidelities, the anger, his paranoia, he is, at the end of the day, the victim of the Colonel. And there's a lot of focus on him as well as Parker. The Colonel starts off the movie narrating, and he continues every now and again. It's a story of a man whose talent is churned out and spat out by the capitalist machine and the capitalist machine's machinists. Except it's a band who made his fame off the talent of black musicians that he could use his literal white privilege to sell. I mean, we can mention that a little bit, but it's a bit too dicey and contentious to really make it a huge focus. Oh, he's a rebel against the conservative small-minded system. No, wait. He's a wayward entertainer who thinks he can change the world with his gifts. So I hope you're beginning to see what the problem is. Again, this movie has nothing to really anchor the story, except we do, and while the Colonel is still a massive presence, its plot strands tend to wave everywhere, and it's really frustrating to watch at the time, especially for how long this movie is. Like, they were so close to something magnificent, and while Hank's performance as the Colonel is odd, it does play into his public persona of being this kind of affable, nice dude, where he comes across like that. He's never shouty, he's never angry. He tries to be as quietly spoken and affable as possible, and it makes his manipulation way more seedy and underhanded. It's a really interesting performance once you look at it like that. He's a stage charmer, cold as ice, and Lerman clearly wants to expose what the entertainment industry was like at that time. It goads you with empty promises and a warm smile until it just spits you out by the end, when you're spent and there's no more use for you. All your efforts are to waste, as your dreams are thus being supplemented by people who just want to keep making themselves richer at your cost, even with somebody as big as to be called a king. That's capitalism, baby. Honestly, the best way to show that this film is distinctive from other biopics is to show it against the other Elvis biopic, the 1979 one directed by John Carpenter. And it's an interesting dichotomy because the 1979 one is a director who's very, very well known for a certain style, trying to break against that mold after one of his films blew up. Halloween was the year before this. And another filmmaker who's very much embellishing his own style to tell this story of this really famous person. And the films have some surprising commonalities. The focus on the mother is pretty much present in both of them. I actually think the 79 one does a better job. Same with the focus on Priscilla Presley. While both go into the suffocation she was feeling, being at the behest of this incredible icon, it also shows that the 79 film is a lot more, gives her more development. It shows more of her desires and uncomfortable realities of the fact that she was really, really young when they met. I don't think the movie condones him too much on her use in either version, but it is glossed over in the new movie, the 79 one. It is a focal point that is brought up. We even have a scene where Sun Records amicably lets Elvis go to pursue his dreams, as well as seeing him see That's Alright Mama perform. Even though the 2022 film, it's a bit more less realistic, let's just say. And I mean, you can say like it's a biopic, it's about to hit these same points, but not really. Like, I mean, as much as they don't think they handle the stuff about Elvis's influence by black culture, which was being burnt out by a white supremacist America, that's a lot more noticed in 2022 one compared to the 79 one, which has one line at that. And even the Colonel is very much limited in the 79 movie. He's there, but he only appears like 2 or 3 times. Now, keep in mind that this was before the extent of his criminality was exposed, and also he was still alive. This movie was made like 2 years after Elvis died. So there could be a lot of legal red tape that could really get over to depict him in that way if they were going to. The difference with these films, and they're very similar length, is that 79 one is way more a traditional biopic. It feels like that. It even has the scene where we have him in later on in life where it flashes back to the beginning of the story. And the 79 one does a lot of interesting things. Like I mentioned going to Priscilla a lot. This movie actually frames the story around his different relationships with women and how they each dictate his life in a certain way. That's really clever. I really enjoyed that. I think Elvis is just a better character in the Carpenter movie. He feels more fleshed out. He feels more like a person. And he does a lot of questionably nasty things, which I really appreciated. They were willing to be that honest. And that's a huge problem I have with the 2022 movie. I don't feel Elvis is as well defined a character as he is in the 79 one. He feels a lot more fleshed out there. But still, the 79 movie is also really rote and dry. And at similar lanes, you feel the length of the 79 movie, definitely compared to the 2022 one. Where Carpenter was not overall happy with how it came out, this film does come from a very personal place.
In dealing with Elvis, I'm bringing a lot of my own feelings to it and how I feel about him. In that sense, I think from my point, it's a personal film, because I really loved Elvis a lot, and I've always been a fan of his and loved his music. And in some sense, I feel lucky to be able to direct a film about Elvis. This kind of a film, which I don't feel is exploiting him, but I really feel is trying to tell his story. A story of a man who's bigger than life. Which is really interesting because he really was a human being, but somewhere in his life I think he transcended that and became mythical.
First of all, God, that's really spiritual and cheerful for Carpenter. But it's also so fascinating that his film is about a man who became an icon and that effect it had on him. While Carpenter's, it's about a superhero who was eventually defeated by his arch nemesis. And I mean, the postscript does tell us that Parker did die disgraced and penniless, but he did win overall. He lived long enough to see what he did destroy the man he was focused on, and whether he wanted it or not, and I do not think he wanted him to die at all. That was his effect, and that was a consequence of what he was doing. Whether he wanted that or not is irrelevant. And just because Lorman gives him a mythic status doesn't mean he doesn't connect with him in a similar way that Carpenter does.
I come from a very tiny town in the middle of nowhere on a highway. We had a farm, and Dad had all sorts of artists live with us. It left me a need to always journey and to absorb. I'm still fulfilled by just watching people and engaging and meeting new people. And I think Elvis was like that. Elvis was always in pursuit of some sort of impossible dream. And it's the impossibility of it that keeps you moving forward. I thought at first it was a very intellectual, academic reason why I thought it would make a great exploration, but I come to understand that his journey and mine are not dissimilar in the sense that, for different reasons, Elvis through music and for myself through story, it was our escape from the world around us, and also our way to travel. It's taken us far and wide, but we're still searching.
And for all my ramblings of making it truthful and avoiding reality and don't listen too hard to the people in the lives of this person and, you know, don't make them too perfect and all that crap. You know what really makes the 2022 Elvis movie stand out? It's a Baz Luhrmann movie. It's Baz Luhrmann telling the story of Elvis. It's not just a story of Elvis. A lot of other biopics, even good ones like Rocket Man and Love and Mercy, they don't tend to have that personal touch that makes them feel less like Wikipedia summaries and more about people exploring other people in these fascinating and nuanced way from their own style, from their own viewpoint. And that's Elvis 2022. Messy, incomprehensible, doesn't always work, but earnest, passionate, with something on its mind. And hell, just ask the director. It isn't a biopic.
I'm not doing a biopic of Elvis Presley. On the one hand, Americans have this ability to absorb. There's such a diversity in America of all kinds of cultures and peoples and inputs. There's an openness to taking all sort of things and making something new. I love that energy. There's also a really good energy about the cell. When those two things are really in balance, that's a great thing. When they get out of balance, tragedy ensues. There's been a lack of that balance lately. We are really too much about the cell now. That motivated me to commit to this idea of using Colonel Tom Parker, the ultimate seller, who was never a colonel, never Tom, never Parker. He was really a carnival Parker who saw the skid and goes, "That's a great act." That's the beauty and the tragedy of the movie. You see them rise and fall.
Maybe saying Elvis is a superhero is a bit too naive to the person he was. But Baz Luhrmann told a superhero story with Elvis. And that's the kind of energy we need when we're looking at biopics in the future. There is no definitive formula to tell a great story with real people, and I didn't really set out to do that. I mean, I like formulas, but I think it's important to assert what kind of privilege you have of handling the lives of these people. Don't besmirch them in a way that really hurts them. At the same time, as I said, we tend to hold a true story on way too high in esteem compared to based on. I think it's ridiculous to believe that every goddamn thing that happens in a fictionalized account of a person's life actually happened in real life. As long as we don't lie about people, and yes, I've gone over this can happen a lot, who cares? And at the end of the day, biopic is a subgenre, and genres are more about how you market something rather than the stories that you tell. Again, I bring up the favourite, as I brought up a billion times, and that can be classified as a biopic if you look at it one way, but it's not. It's historical drama because that's how it's sold to you. So I think the creative reverie of taking a person's life and examining that and what it means, even in contemporary times, is an important and useful one. As long as we look away from the idea that we are telling the definitive story of this person, we should be okay. We all knew Elvis the icon, but we didn't at the time know about Elvis as told by the dude who made Moulin Rouge. And I know which prospect of these excites me more. outside. I'm hoping the mic doesn't pick it up. I can't close the window because it's too hot. My life is hell